Howdy, friends, and welcome to the StoryField. This is a podcast where we talk about business, faith, and life in general.
Okay, so here's the deal. We want you to be encouraged. We want you living in hope. This life we live is complex. It's hard at times. At the StoryField, you will find great stories of normal people just like us who will inspire you. Our goal is that you leave encouraged, inspired, and excited to move forward in life. But before we get started, one thing though, if you're listening and you find yourself really hopeless right now, send us an email at hope@thestoryfield.com so we can pray for you. Thanks for joining us today. Let's get started.
So, hey, StoryField, I'm really excited. I'm always excited, but I'm super excited to have Roland Warren on the show today. Roland, thanks for making time. I'm really honored.
Glad to be with you. Appreciate it, Josh.
Yeah. So I'm going to start off a little bit different than I would normally do just because I had the thought this morning. Let me ask you a big question to start it. And then I want to get into some cool things, the cool things about your new book and some biography stuff and then some questions. But here's the question, and let's just swing hard at this. So being a huge pro-life advocate and a guy for a lot of your, maybe most of your career, how in the world do you engage in a healthy way, in a fruitful way with somebody who's pro-choice? Let's just go for it if that's all right.
The first thing you have to, I think the first thing you have to do is you have to ask a question. Is this a person who's pro-choice and saying that, and a Christian who's pro-choice, or is this a person who's pro-choice and not a Christian? Because in my view, you'd handle those situations differently.
Can you take those two roads for us?
Sure. Well, let's imagine the person is a Christian, right? They say that they're a pro-choice Christian. They have that position. When I'm talking to Christians who are pro-choice, I always start with the foundational kind of bookends, if you will, of what it means to be a Christian. Like, what's the call of Christ? And Christianity is very simple in this context. It's basically to live out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission. That's essentially what Christ did. He walked around living out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission. On the cross, living out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission. So these are the words of Jesus and the life of Jesus. So no matter what kind of Christian you call yourself, whatever kind of adjective you put in front of Christian, which I don't ascribe to, but if you do have one, whether you're a red letter Christian or call yourself a progressive Christian or whatever, it doesn't matter. Nobody gets a pass on the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. These are from the life of Jesus and the words of Jesus that we're called to do, right? So that's why I always start with anybody who's a Christian. I say, okay, if you're a Christian, then Great Commandment, Great Commission. Okay. So what you have to help that person do is find the life issue in the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. And so my question to them is always, okay, how do you reconcile your position on abortion through the Great Commandment and the Great Commission, right? So a great place to start with that for Christians is Luke 10:27, that passage where Jesus is approached by a lawyer. You're a lawyer.
Okay, right? Yeah, there
Everybody's
you go.
Talking
There's
about
always a lawyer messing something up, I swear. Like
always lawyers, right?
Yeah.
And the life issue, it's who's talking about it? It's lawyers, right? It's about the law and this, that, and the other, right? So the lawyer comes to Jesus and says, what must I do to inherit the kingdom of God? Jesus says, well, what's the book say? Well, he says, okay, it says, love God with your heart, your soul, your strength, and your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus is like, thumbs up, you got it right. Now, here's the thing. When you look at that passage and when you look at it in the Greeks to get a better understanding of what's being said there, the kind of love that Jesus is talking about there is agapeo love, right? So it's sacrificial love. So you're supposed to sacrificially love your neighbor. Got it. Okay. The Greek word for neighbor means near one or near fellow. So you're near one or near fellow. Now, here's the thing. A woman who's facing an unplanned pregnancy, a woman who's pregnant just in general, the child in her womb is her neighbor. Why? Because we talk about nearness in terms of two ways. In terms of proximity, I'm next to you, or relationship, I'm your next of kin. Right? Oh, wow. So the baby in the womb is her next of kin, next to her in the most intimate way. Same thing for the guy who got her pregnant, right? It's bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. Okay. So the reason why is, as a Christian, you can't support abortion is because it's a violation of the great commandment.
Oh man.
Do you
Yeah.
see? It's a
Uh-huh.
violation of the great commandment because aborting a child is not an act of love. Now, in the great commandment, there are three loves: love of God, love of neighbor, love of self. Love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, right? Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. So, if anything that we do as Christians should be reconciled through those three interconnected loves. Any act that we do, if it's a violation of love of God, but it's a love of neighbor, then it's violating the great commandment. If you affirm one of them and not all three of them,
Yeah.
right? So you can walk through that perspective. So you say, okay, so abortion is a violation of the great commandment. You can't reconcile that. Now, Jesus understands the dilemma that the lawyer faces because his next question is what? Who's my neighbor? Why does he say that? Because
Yeah.
he realizes that Jesus just expanded the neighborhood.
Yeah.
He had a
Yeah.
very narrow neighborhood,
Yeah.
right? And Jesus just he just made it bigger. So you're like, well, wait a minute, how can I narrow this neighborhood down? And I always tell people this is where Mr. Rogers and Big Bird meet. Because Mr. Rogers, he had his cardigan, he get a little James Brown on you. Like,
Yeah.
won't you be my neighbor? Please, won't you please just beg, please, right? And then Big Bird and his crew run around and say, who are the people in my neighborhood? Who are the people? They would run. The baby in the womb is saying, won't you be my neighbor?
Mm.
And the culture is saying, who are the people in my neighborhood? So Jesus, understanding this man's dilemma, doesn't answer his question with an answer. He answers with a story. And he tells the story of what? The Good Samaritan. And in the story of the Good Samaritan, you have a neighbor, right, who cannot advocate for himself, a vulnerable neighbor who cannot advocate for himself. And the church people go to the other side of the road. The priest and the Levite, they go to the other side of the road. And the interesting thing is, the priest and the Levi both knew the great commandment.
Oh yeah, for sure.
They did. If anybody knows the great commandment,
Uh-huh.
the priest and the Levite, but yet they went to the other side of the word. What did they do? They created a neighborhood that excluded the most vulnerable. See the problem?
100%.
And what is the Good Samaritan? He goes near the near one, in other words, time, talent, and treasure. And then Jesus says to the lawyer, so who was a neighbor to the man who fell? In other words, who's living out the great commandment? And then the lawyer says, well, the one who showed him mercy. The Hebrew word for mercy has the same root as the word for compassion and the word for womb.
Oh, wow.
So essentially what the lawyer is saying is the one who put the man in the womb. Because a womb is supposed to be a place of mercy. The most vulnerable place that any of us have ever been is in our mother's womb.
Wow.
And this is the reason why when it says Jesus was like us in all ways, yet without sin, he started where? In a womb. And he ended where? In a tomb. Where do we start? In a womb. Where will we end? In a tomb.
Yeah.
Do you see?
Uh-huh.
So the womb is supposed to be a place of mercy, and the only language a baby has is a heartbeat. And that heartbeat, I tell people all the time, the heartbeat is God's way of giving that baby voice that says, have mercy, have mercy, have mercy, have mercy. And what does the mother do? She says, I will agapeo you. I will sacrificially love you, right? So any woman who gives birth to a baby, whether she's a Christian or not, is living out the great commandment. It's a universal truth. Why? Because by protecting one of God's image bearers, she's showing love for God. By protecting the image bearer, she's showing love for the image bearer. And by protecting God's image bearer, she's also showing love for herself. Why? Because when you kill, harm, lack compassion and mercy for one of God's image bearers, guess what? You create antipathy between you and God, a conflict between you and God, the almighty God of the universe. That's not love for you. It's like jumping in the ring with Mike Tyson in his prime.
Yeah.
Except way worse than that.
Yeah.
So that's why I start with Christians.
Yeah.
I don't start with when does life begin and I don't start there with Christians. You can use like sort of secular arguments with Christians, right? I don't start there. I start with you need to reconcile the Great Commandment, but you also need to reconcile the Great Commission, because remember, those are two bookends. The Great Commission is to make disciples of who? Our neighbors. Now, as a parent, who's your first neighborhood?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Your children.
Oh, for sure.
Killing one of your children is not an act of discipleship, not even during the teen years, right? So,
no.
Right?
For sure.
So abortion is not only a violation of the Great Commandment, it's a violation of the Great Commission. That's why Christians can't support abortion. So that's what I say to Christians. And if they, I really believe firmly that if they truly are seeking and trying to understand this, I mean, they're really
Yeah.
trying to understand this. I believe that the Holy Spirit, which indwells them, will speak to that and affirm, yes, you're supposed to live out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission. And frankly, the distinction between conservative and liberal Christians
Yeah.
is all about the Great Commandment. Why? It's who's in your neighborhood.
Yeah. Oh
So
man.
the
Yeah.
liberals say, you've left these people out of the neighborhood.
Hmm.
And the conservatives say, well, you left those people out of the neighborhood. And into this mix, right, walks Jesus.
Yeah. Oh
And he
man.
basically says, wide is the neighborhood, narrow is the HOA.
Yeah.
Right? So
For real.
wide is the neighborhood, right? So
Yeah.
come as you are, right?
Yeah.
But narrow is the HOA. Don't stay as you came. So in your old neighborhood, you used to park your truck on your lawn and put it on bricks.
Yeah.
Not in this neighborhood. So
Yeah.
you come, but we have an HOA that guides us, and the HOA in this context is the Word of God. So whether you're a conservative or liberal or this or whatever you frame yourself, the reality is the HOA is the Word of God.
Mhm.
And what does he say? All the laws rest on these. What? The Great Commandment. And the
Yeah.
last thing he said for us to do is the Great Commission. In other words, that's in the HOA. This is
Mhm.
the provision, so you should check that. And I think also, frankly, I'll just kind of move on after this, but I think for people who call themselves progressive Christians,
Mhm.
they love the Great Commandment because
Mhm.
all of their good work is all tied up with the Great Commandment. The
Mhm.
problem is they've created a neighborhood that doesn't include the most vulnerable. In other words, just like the priest and the Levi,
Yeah.
who were out to do good work in other areas probably, but they
Mhm.
had created a neighborhood that excluded the most vulnerable, and that's why Jesus kind of laid it out that way. So that's what I do with Christians. Now, for non-Christians is a different argument. I
Yeah.
start with non-Christians with the perspective of this, and here's a framework that you have to think about. If you want somebody to be pro-life, who's pro-choice, the first thing you have to convince them to do is to be pro-life. And by the way,
Mm.
all this stuff is laid out in my book. Everything I said to you, it's in the book.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we're gonna get into that. I love that. Yeah, you're
But
setting this up nicely.
so the first thing, this is counterintuitive. If someone who's pro-choice, the first thing you have to do if you want them to become pro-life is get them to become pro-choice. In other words, what are the two choices? So I had a conversation once some years ago. I had a donor that invited me to a meeting to meet with a guy who they thought was pro-life, and so he introduced me and the whole thing, and Roland Warren with Care Dad, whatever. And the guy turns to me before I can say anything and says, "So you don't believe that a woman should have the right to her own body, do you?"
Oh wow, here we go,
I
man.
looked at the donor. I was like, I said to him, "So you're pro-choice?" He said, "Yes, I am." And so I answered his question. Yeah, I do believe that she should have a right to her own body. What I didn't say was the next point that most people say was, but we're not talking about her body. We're talking about a body inside her body. I didn't say that.
Yeah.
Right? I said, but let me, I want to understand, I want to make sure I understand your position. So if you're pro-choice, let me just take a piece of paper. And I took a piece of paper and I wrote a circle. Wrote a circle and I put a line through the middle of it. And I said, what are the two choices? Well, one's abortion and one's birth. Gotcha.
Mm.
So I want to make sure I understand your position from conception to birth is that you don't care which choice a woman makes as long as she has the right to make it. He said, absolutely. Okay, I said, great. So then on the side that had abortion, I wrote the word obstacles. And on the side that had birth, I wrote the word obstacles. And I said, okay, so you want to remove all the obstacles to abortion. Any obstacles, political, social, you want to remove every single one of those obstacles. He said, absolutely, absolutely want to remove all those obstacles. I said, okay. And then I got a little Columbo on him, Columbo, and I kind of scratched my head a little bit. And I said, so let's move to the other side of the circle where I wrote obstacles to birth. And I said, you also want to remove any obstacles to birth. So if a woman's facing an unplanned pregnancy and is facing obstacles, you want to remove those obstacles just as aggressively as you want to remove the obstacles to abortion. And he paused for a minute and he said, well, yes, I do. And I said, well, let's write down what some of those obstacles could be. Well, the father's not involved. She doesn't have a place to live. She's lacking, a job. Or I just walked through all these different obstacles that he had. He said, yeah, well, we got to remove all those. I said, okay. Then I drew a second circle and I wrote the word birth. I said, well, here's my position. I'm pro-life from conception to birth. So I don't have to have abortion in my circle. All I have to have is birth.
Mhm.
And then I wrote the word obstacle next to my circle. And I said, see, from conception to birth, I want to remove all the obstacles to birth. And then I took my pencil and I made a Venn diagram. In other words, I connected the birth side of his circle to the birth side of my circle. And I said, guess what? We have common ground.
Oh,
Here's the
wow.
thing, right? You and I are in agreement that we want to remove obstacles to birth for a woman who's facing an unplanned pregnancy. So my question to you is, what are you doing to remove the obstacles to birth from conception to birth? I know you want to do stuff after birth, but from conception to birth, when she's making that decision, what are you doing to remove those obstacles? Most pro-choice people aren't doing anything to remove any of their obstacles. All their time, talent, and treasure is focused on the abortion side. So
Yeah.
this is one of the problems that we have. See, just think about it like a battle. We attack their most fortified position. In other words, their support for abortion. Then they say, well, what about case of rape? Or like they want to keep the conversation on their support for abortion.
Mhm.
But they don't want to have a conversation about what they're not doing on the side for birth. And we attack their most fortified position, leave
Yeah.
that position alone, attack their vulnerable position. It's
Yeah.
the weak underbelly. What they're not doing to help a woman who's facing an unplanned pregnancy, who wants to bring her child into the world. And by the way, that's the vast majority of women. And the reason why they choose abortion is because their community, their family, the culture, the government has spent more time, talent, and treasure removing obstacles to
Yeah.
abortion than obstacles to birth. But if you're pro-choice, you have just as much responsibility as I do as a pro-life person to remove obstacles to birth. So if they say, well, this woman, she's going to have this child, and she's going to bring it into the world, she ain't going to be able to take care of it. Well, if that was her choice, and then they say to pro-life people, well, what are you going to do to take care of that child? And I say to them, are you pro-choice? They say, yeah. Well, this was her choice. Yeah. So you have just as much as an obligation to take care of that child as I do. So my question is, what are you going to do to take care of that child? See, this is a flaw that we've had in our argument. We
Yeah.
let them box us in and say, no, we have responsibility for all these kids that come into the world. These are kids that come in from a woman's choice. And you don't have to agree with her choice.
Yeah.
That's what they're saying to us. You don't have to agree with a woman's choice to abortion, but you need to support it. Well, I say to you, you don't have to agree with a woman's choice to birth, but you have to support it if you're pro-choice.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. I don't have to support her choice to abortion because that ain't in my circle. But you have to support her choice for birth because it is in your circle. Now, why is this
Wow.
important? For two reasons. Reason one, I don't call pro-choice people pro-abortion unless they actually are. And there are some, like Margaret Sanger and Hitler and people like that. But most people who are on the side of supporting abortion are not actually pro-abortion. They're pro-choice.
Right.
If you actually have a conversation with them, they're not like Margaret Sanger said, you should not have a child because you're this color or this economic status. And that's why she was all about what? Sterilization. Like that's pro-abortion. Like I'm going to determine who
Yeah.
has the child, right? I'm not trying to
Yeah.
remove obstacles to abortion. I'm trying to determine that there's only one choice for you. But that's not where most people who are pro-choice are. They're actually in this circle. And the line could be in the middle or over to the side in terms of how they split that, right? So I don't call people pro-abortion unless they actually are. And most people are not. Now, why don't I do that? Because I want to create common ground. Because there can be no transformation of thinking without conversation. And in order to have conversation, you have to have a starting point. If you spoke Spanish and I spoke French, ain't no translate. I don't care how passionate we can.
Yeah.
So you need common ground between the two sides. And so I want to make sure that a pro-choice person understands that they have a life-affirming aspect to their worldview. Now, I drew that circle. Now, why is that really important? Here's the thing. I noticed this about my wife who's a gardener. A lot of times she'll plant like ground cover and then she'll put a pathway of stone. And one of my observations about this when it happens is that the stones never overgrow like they don't move.
Yeah.
The ground cover overgrows the stones unless you cut it back. Now, if you look at the pro-choice worldview, right, there's the same dynamic. Stones are dead and grass and ground cover is alive. It grows, right? So if you have a pro-choice perspective, you have a living aspect of your worldview and a dead part of your aspect. The abortion part's the dead part, right? The life part's the
Oh, yeah.
okay. Now, what we're called to do is remind them that they have a living part and then to water that living part.
Oh, yeah.
Water the living part. Why? Because it will grow. So you think about anybody who was once pro-choice and became pro-life, that's exactly what happened. So you think about someone like Abby Johnson that people know about, right? She was working in an abortion clinic, and then she was helping out, assisting in abortion. She was looking at the screen while the doctor was, doing the procedure, and he said, "Beam me up, Scotty," I think, or something like that. And what happened? The life part of her worldview began to grow. And what happens with life? It grows and grows and grows and grows and grows until there's no abortion part left. So that's why you want a pro-choice person, right, to come to a pregnancy center or places like that so they can see, like, don't be arguing with them about their support for abortion. Just show them the life part.
Oh, wow.
And by the power of the Holy Spirit, we water it, water it, water it, and it grows. Now, if you don't help them see that they even have, if your perspective is their circle just has the word abortion and my circle has the word birth, there's no common ground. You just argue it. You're never going to have anything. So again, for pro-life people, for pro-choice people or Christians, Great Commandment, Great Commission. For pro-choice people who are not Christians, you create common ground and then you water and allow that to grow. Again, both of these frameworks are at the end of the book in the section called Frameworks: How to Talk to Pro-Choice Christians, how to create common ground with pro-choice folks who are not Christians. So, long answer to a short question.
Oh, that's perfect, man. So, Roland Warren is the author of The Alternative to Abortion: Why We Must Be Pro-Abundant Life, which you probably touched on some, but I want to get back to that. But let me do a little bit of really cool things about your story. And the first I'm going to be, and probably one that shaped maybe a lot of your ministry, was you had an unplanned pregnancy, you and your wife, in college. So I want to get into that. You're a graduate of Princeton and the Wharton School of Business. So, man, I was looking at some of the acceptance rates on both those schools. I mean, man, that's a small that's a small sliver. So that's really awesome. 20 years in the corporate world, 11 years as the president of National Fatherhood Initiative, and then you joined CareNet in 2012. So you're celebrating 13 years, or coming on 13 years at CareNet. I want to ask you, and you have several books. And I do kind of want to, if we have time, I want to ask a little bit about some of the 8 biggest mistakes that you wrote. You have a book called Bad Dads of the Bible. I love that. 8 mistakes every good dad can avoid. And then the book, and really kind of really cool, big time national media appearances, Roland, when like the Oprah Winfrey Show, Today Show, CNN, C-SPAN. So you've really experienced a really cool national media audience and been interviewed by the Wall Street Journal and USA Today. So, man, thank you. Like, I love that. And I love your voice in all those arenas because it's clear you love life. So we always like to start with a little bit of a story. So can you introduce yourself as far as like a little bit where you grew up, and let's get to the college and, the birth of your first child during college. I guess you had 2 in college. Is that right? So let's talk about that and how that shaped, and let's get into the book more and specifically set up. Give us kind of the big picture of it. And I want to talk about abundant. I love the fact that you set up on abundant. So that's kind of a long intro as far as getting us going, but get us going on kind of where you grew up, your story, college experience, and all that stuff. So it kind of all shaped you.
Hey, y'all. I just want to make an observation. When I see someone going through a legal situation, it seems like there are way too many unknowns. Well, the Allen firm provides legal guidance so that you can make a great decision, come to a resolution, and be at peace. For more information about the Allen firm, visit allenlawfirm.com.
Yeah. Well, the Princeton thing is really where a lot of my perspective on this issue started. And as you said, my wife, Yvette, and I faced an unplanned pregnancy. She was a sophomore. I was a junior. And we were Christians doing stuff Christians ain't supposed to be doing, and
Yeah. Yep.
the consequences of that. And when she came to Student Health Services to take the pregnancy test, the nurse came back and said, "Yeah, the test is positive," and without missing a beat, she said, now, of course, you're going to have an abortion. And Yvette says, well, I don't want to have an abortion. I want to have my baby. And the nurse is like, well, how are you going to graduate from Princeton with a baby? Doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense. And what do you want to do when you graduate? Oh, you want to become a doctor? My gosh, how are you going to become a doctor with a baby?
Oh my
That
gosh.
kind of a thing. So, Yvette kind of came back to the dorm, and I imagine we kind of discussed it. And I just kind of said, hey, we're going to move forward with the plan. And she wanted to move forward with the plan. And so we did. We got married, by Justice of the Peace at Princeton with about 4 students there with us. And we just started our life together. She ended up having actually our second son at Princeton, her senior year.
Okay.
Both of our kids were born at Princeton.
That's great,
She
man.
went on to graduate there, went on to graduate from medical school, be chief resident for program, has been a doctor practicing, I don't know, 25, 30 years or so. So,
Oh wow.
so we saw kind of firsthand, God, how he honored, that decision to do that. So there's some aspects of that that really informed me in terms of like how to think about the life issue, in a more holistic way. God really used that aspect of my life narrative, and also the work that I did with when I was president of the National Fatherhood Initiative in terms of the role of men and fathers, to really kind of move me to a perspective that essentially I kind of encourage Christians that we shouldn't be calling ourselves pro-life. We should be calling ourselves pro-abundant life,
I love that.
based on John 10:10, where Christ said, I came that you might have life and then have that life abundantly.
Yeah.
And again, if you look at that passage, what is Jesus saying? I mean, he's talking about 2 types of life there, right? He's talking about bios, B-I-O-S, where we get the word biology, which is physical life. But he's also talking about Zoe, which is a unique type of spiritual life that only comes from a relationship with God. So essentially, he's saying, I came to link your bios to my Zoe, that you might be heartbeats that are heaven bound. Heartbeats that are heaven bound. And so when God kind of downloaded that into my brain, and I started looking at the pro-life movement through that lens, what I realized was that's not really what pro-life actually is in the minds of most people, and certainly not in the political narrative. So there's a focus on bios, saving physical lives, but there's not a focus on this on heartbeats that are heaven bound. In other words, having being saved for eternity as well. You know what I'm saying? For this world and for the world to come. And a friend of mine says, for a ministry called ICU Mobile that we recently merged, she said, her ministry is about for those not yet born and not yet born again. Right.
Oh yeah. That's just really
right.
awesome.
Which is super awesome, because that's basically
it is.
saying, I came for those not yet born and not yet born again. And so that really caused me to start thinking about this issue very differently, because you can be an atheist and be pro-life, but you can't be an atheist and be pro-abundant life. And I think as Christians, we have a higher calling. Now, so that was the opening framework, and I talk about again a lot of this in the book, and I have this graphic where I show a house with a roof that says pro-abundant life, and then I talk about these 2 pillars that hold up the roof, and that first pillar is God's design for family, and focus on the most celebrated unplanned pregnancy in human existence, which is the birth of Christ.
Yeah.
Right?
I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, I mean, it was an
for sure.
From Mary's perspective, right? She had hopes for her life and dreams for her life. They did not include a child at this time and in this way. And in fact, her dilemma that she faced was very similar to my wife's. I mean, my wife, Wage, got pregnant, obviously very different, but the consequences afterwards were pretty much the same. How am I going to take care of this baby? What's Joseph going to say? What's my family going to say? What's my community going to say? And what does Mary do in that moment? She doesn't lean into the uncertainty of what she doesn't know. She focuses on the certainty of what she does. There's a life growing inside of her. And it's not a life worth sacrificing, but a life worth sacrificing. She says, Leon, and she says, what? As you said unto me, like, let it be, right? Which is essentially the same thing that my wife said when she decided not to have the abortion. She said, no, let it be unto me as you have said. So in other words, she tapped into her inner Mary and ascribed to herself the virtue and the character of Mary after the pregnancy, right? So, for a lot of folks, they say, got it. We're supposed to be helping the proverbial Mary, saving the proverbial Jesus.
Yeah.
Let's get moving. But you got to keep reading. What did God do to make sure that Mary's unplanned pregnancy wasn't a crisis pregnancy? He sent an angel to Joseph. And Joseph, right, had a similar dilemma as any abortion-minded man. Hopes for his life, dreams for his life that did not include a child at this time and in this way. And Joseph has a plan. And his plan essentially is to divorce her quietly, right? To put her away quietly, Why? Because back then, that's how you frankly did a cultural abortion. You couldn't abort the baby, put the baby away, so you put the woman and the baby away, and they were often stoned. And so you'd stone the woman, which means you stone the baby as well. And the angel comes to Joseph and says, "Listen, I know you got this plan, but I have a different plan for you, to be a husband to her and a father to the child growing inside of her." And Joseph, like Mary, says, "What? Let it be unto me as you have said." And he does that. So what you see God doing to respond to an unplanned pregnancy is he creates a family. Creates a family.
Wow.
He doesn't give Mary, a check and a baby daddy, not even
Yeah.
the Message version of the Bible, right? I mean,
Yeah.
he
Yep.
gives her a husband for her and a father for the child growing inside of her. So I started to really challenge, and I said, is that really what we're trying to do in the pro-life movement?
Mm.
Or are we trying to help women and save babies? Again, that's an important thing to do. But are we trying to build families? Are we
Oh, yeah.
as Christians looking at the most celebrated unplanned pregnancy and what God did and how he responded? And the answer is no. Because for so long in the movement, we kind of told men that they're kind of over here, maybe that support something,
Mhm.
but they're not part of the picture. But God sent an angel to Mary and an angel to Joseph, and they both got a call within their humanity
Mhm.
and within the uniqueness of their humanity. Mary was a woman. She could bring the Christ child into the world. Joseph was a man. He could provide and protect, right? And that was it. So the Holy Family was holy family, a father and
Yeah.
mother united in marriage, loving each other, loving God, loving their child. So to me,
Yeah.
that's the high idea. So that's the difference between being pro-life and being pro-abundant life,
Mhm.
because you're actually trying to build a family and not as an afterthought, but as a primary objective. And again, even if that woman's not going to marry that guy, which I know that's not possible in some cases, the reality is that she's dealing with motherhood, fatherhood, sex, and marriage, and God's design for those things. So if you help her bring the child into the world and she chooses life, the reality is if she doesn't reconnect those God
Mhm.
ordained sort of constructs, guess what happens so often? She gets pregnant again. Now we got a different pregnancy with a different guy. Now,
Yeah.
from a pro-life perspective, yep, check, check. She's got two babies with two different guys, three
Yeah.
babies with three different guys.
Yeah.
From a pro-abundant life perspective, that's transactional.
Mhm.
Pro-abundant life is but being transformational, right? Because Jesus said, "Come as you are, but don't stay as you came. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And God's design for family is a transformational institution that He designed. And so the sanctity of marriage and family and the sanctity of life are embedded in the story of Mary and Joseph. The first thing the angel told Joseph was, "Do not be afraid to take Mary as your what? Baby mama?
Mhm.
No,
Yeah.
wife." In other words, he affirmed the
Yeah.
sanctity of marriage and family even before he told him who Joseph was. So I started this framework. I said, well, then we need to have what we're solving for, and that's what CareNet's all about. We're solving for God's design for family. Now, why does that make
Yeah.
sense? Well, it makes sense for one very practical reason. If you look at the data, 87% of the women that have abortions are unmarried.
Mm.
So if you're going to try to solve the abortion issue without the marriage issue, ain't happening.
Yeah. That was one of my questions. I mean, that you talked about, like, why do families, like, about families? I
Yeah.
mean, just like, yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And I tell people, like, my wife and I, we had one unplanned pregnancy. Second one, she tricked me. No, I'm just kidding. But
Yeah. Yeah.
but what happened? Why did we have, like, we didn't have a crisis pregnancy. We had an unplanned pregnancy. Why? Because we created a family. We created a
Mhm.
family, and so aspirationally, as Christians, shouldn't we be trying to solve for the high idea? Shouldn't we build an infrastructure and a movement that is not just a counter to the pro-choice side? It says, well, this is just about a woman plus a question mark, and we say, no, it's about a woman plus a baby. There's no guy in either one
Yeah.
of those pictures. We're not
Yeah.
just supposed to be a sort of a doppelganger to what they're doing.
Yeah.
We have to reject their entire framing and say, no, 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 this is about a woman, it's about a man, it's about a baby, it's about a family, it's about God's design for the family. So that first pillar of a pro-abundant life perspective is God's design for family. Yeah.
Wow. That's beautiful. Um, how does CareNet, let's talk about that for a second. How does CareNet help? I'm assuming they're a huge resource for many, like, care centers, pregnancy centers all over. Maybe, I don't know. I could be wrong. Tell me about CareNet for a second. Then
Yep.
how do, how do how does a pregnancy care center think about that? Because we have people listening who have
Yep.
care centers and board members and all that. And then how does us, the church, like think and help in that terms to help push the movement, kind of the pro abundant life movement forward.
Unstuck Coaches hates it when movement and progress in a person's life or business is stuck or frozen or slowed or just stopped altogether. Well, we have found a solution. Unstuckcoaches.com. They offer a variety of coaching services to get you or your business moving again. Check out unstuckcoaches.com.
Yeah, well, the pregnancy centers, the role for pregnancy centers is kind of an amazing thing. I mean, Karen has a network of, 1,200 plus of pregnancy centers
Yeah.
across the country that offer compassion, hope, and help to women and men facing pregnancy decisions. And, when someone's facing a pregnancy decision, they're making that decision from conception to birth,
Yeah.
basically. And they're making the decision about the support they do or don't have after birth. So this issue is about
Oh, wow.
in 1 second. Right? So a pregnancy center plays a very powerful role, specifically in a situation where a woman does not have a guy who says, "I'll be a husband to you and a father to the child growing inside of you" at some level. I mean, they're there, but even when they do, the reality is the pregnancy center kind of steps into sort of the storm and tries to encourage the woman to go into the eye of the storm. Right? The storm is still there. You're still facing unplanned pregnancy, but in the eye of the storm, there's calm. You can look up and you can hear from God, and you can look around and see the resources and the support that you have. And then you step back in the storm, understanding that God is with you and that you got these resources to support you. So a pregnancy center is kind of one of the first steps of resources for women that are at risk for abortion. And that's really what we try to target, someone who is in this situation and thinks that she has no other options than having an abortion. So we try to offer her compassion, hope, help, discipleship. We do ultrasounds, we
Wow.
provide all kinds of support in that regard. But that support is limited in the sense that it's from conception to birth, maybe a little bit further. But if she has a 10-year-old,
Yeah.
and brings her to a pregnancy center, ain't much we can do for you. So how does God make sure that women have to get the support, and women and children get the support that they need? Well, husbands and fathers, right? So that's why
Yeah.
you want to engage the guy, because he provides that support. So in my case, for the first 5 months of my wife's pregnancy, I was the only one that knew she was pregnant other than her.
Yeah.
Now, why was she less likely to have an abortion? Well, because she had a guy who said, "I'll be a husband to you and a father to the child growing inside of you." That's why she wasn't part of that 87% by the
Yeah.
grace of God, right? So
Yeah.
we got to work aggressively. And it's what our pregnancy centers are doing more and more. It's working aggressively to make sure that women, are not women are not that coming to the pregnancy center alone. That we have men's ministries, and we want men to come. We want to engage him to help her, help him, help them. In other words, that piece,
Yeah.
and he needs to be there as well, so we can encourage him to tap into his inner Joseph, while we're trying to encourage her to tap into her inner.
I mean, he's a huge piece of the puzzle,
Yes,
and he
he
just
is.
gets left to the wayside normally in that
Well, he
situation.
does. Yeah. And that's a real mistake. In fact, we did a national survey of women who had abortions, and we found that when we asked them who did they talk to about their abortion decision, and we gave them a long list of people, their mother, their best friend, their father, abortion providers, all kinds of folks. Number one was the guy who got her pregnant. He was number one. And then we asked her who was the most influential in her decision to abort, and it was the guy who got her pregnant. Then we did the same survey, and we asked men the same question. And so we did this with Lifeway, and we asked men, who did she talk to about the abortion decision? He said me, number one, same list. And we asked who was the most influential in her decision to abort, and the guy said I was. So the woman who has the abortion and the guy who participates both saying that he was the most influential. And we built an
Wow.
entire movement for nearly 50 years that doesn't have a proactive effort to engage him in the way that God did with Joseph.
Oh man.
So
Yeah.
that's when you can see that distinction between being pro-life and being pro-abundant life, why that's so important. So yeah, you want to engage that guy. Now, here's the point. Let's say you can't engage the guy. He won't step into that role. Well, that's the role of the church.
Yeah.
Right. So if you think about James 1:27, it talks about religion that God our Father finds is pure and faultless to care for the orphans and widows in their distress, right? What was an orphan when that was written? It was a child without a father. It was a widow. It was typically a mother without a husband.
Mm.
right? So they're
Yeah.
missing that. But the difference is that proverbial husband and father are saying to the mother and the child, "You're dead to me," as opposed to what happened then, which was they were actually dead. So
Yeah.
the church has a very specific role to step into that gap to provide the physical, emotional, spiritual, and social support. But there's another reason that's very important for the church to step into this gap, which is the second pillar of a pro-abundant life perspective. The first pillar is God's design for family.
Mm-hmm.
The second pillar is God's call to discipleship. In other words, when you look at a life issue, you should be thinking about it through those two lenses. Like you should be thinking, okay, not who do I need to vote for so she can't have an abortion, or what kind of material support does she need. I mean, you care about those things, but your primary thing should be she needs to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. The
Yeah.
child growing inside of her needs to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. The guy who got her pregnant needs to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And so God's design for family is linked to God's call to discipleship. So you want to disciple
Wow.
her, him, them, so they can be disciples who make disciples who live and love like Jesus. So a pro-abundant
Wow.
life perspective links those two together. Now, how is that tied back to John 10:10? What did Christ say? It came that you might have life, right? Have that life and have it abundantly. In other words, to link your bios to my Zoe, that you might be heartbeats that are heaven bound. When a woman has a guy who says, I'll be a husband to you and a father to the child growing inside of her, guess what she's more likely to give the child? Bios, physical life. And when that family gets connected to the church to be disciples who make disciples who live and love like Jesus, what does that lead to? Zoe, right? The spiritual
Yeah.
life that we want. Do you see? So a
Uh-huh.
pro-abundant life perspective is uniquely Christian. It's uniquely what we're called to. And I'll just make one kind of final point to put a kind of maybe a final nail on this. The fact of the matter is, when someone says they're pro-life today, I always ask, what do you mean by that?
Mm.
Because the term, it's not an absolute anymore. So for what I mean by that, like, so one person says, okay, I'm pro-life. We'll explain it. Well, I believe in Imago Dei. I believe that the circumstances of a child's conception and birth should not determine its humanity and worth, whether you're conceived in love or lust, whether you're planned or unplanned, whether you have fetal abnormality, like, it doesn't matter. Your humanity is intact because it's tied to God,
Yeah.
right? That's pro-life. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
That's pro-life.
Yeah.
What about you? Well, you're pro-life too. Yeah. Okay, I'm pro-life, but I have exceptions. I'm for a 15-week ban. I think we should have abortion at 15 weeks. We should ban it after that. I said, okay, so you're pro-life too. Yeah, yeah, that's my position. And you're pro-life. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well, how many abortions happen before 15 weeks? 96%.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah.
What about you? Well, I'm pro-life too. What are you? Well, I'm 20 weeks. When babies can maybe feel
Oh wow.
pain, whatever. Well, how many abortions happen before 20 weeks? 99%. These are all
Yeah.
positions in the public square that are considered pro-life positions,
Yeah.
right? So, particularly in the political. So the problem is that the term pro-life, because we gave it to the politics. It's not a fixed thing anymore. It's on a spectrum. It's on a spectrum. So we took something that's absolute. It's not now. And maybe say this better. If you think about like the role of politics or the nature of politics, right? Essentially, what you have in a political process is two people that come together with a conviction, right? So I'm an environmentalist and I'm big lumber, whatever, right? Right. So we both have convictions, and then we come together in the political process and compromise. We basically compromise our convictions. You give up a little bit of your convictions. That process is designed for compromising of convictions. The problem is if you have an issue where there's no, like, you can't,
yeah.
and you give it to that process, you're going to have a problem. So you see that, for example, when Solomon had the dilemma that he had when those two women came to him and there was just one baby.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And he says, well, what are we going to do here? And they say, well, let's split the baby. Now, that was a political, like, they came to him in a political framework. And he said, well, let's split the baby. Of course, he didn't want to, but he said, well, let's let the politics deal with it. Well, we split the baby and you get somebody. Well, the mother said, well, wait a minute. That don't work. This ain't that kind of thing. Why? Because she was looking for righteousness and justice.
Yeah.
She was looking to protect the vulnerable.
Yeah.
So she said, you can't split the baby. No, let her have it. Do you see? So Solomon, wisdom, wanted righteousness and justice. He brought them through a process where they started with a political narrative, which was compromise, splitting the baby.
Mhm.
And they ended with righteousness and justice. In other words, he went from sort of a judge to a priest in terms of how he
Wow.
started to think about that. You see? So
Mhm.
if you're the baby in the womb, like if you were in that baby, you could have an answer. Well, hold on a second.
Yeah,
Who do I
yeah.
want? Like, wait a minute. What the political
You-
process? I can end up dead as part of your compromise.
Yeah,
Yeah. What about y'all? No, we believe in Imago Dei, righteousness and
yeah,
justice. Oh, well, then I want these guys leading. I don't want
yeah,
those guys leading because they're
yeah.
going to change based on the political narrative. These guys are connected to something immutable, unchangeable, and unfixed,
Mhm.
a fixed thing. So we took the life issue and we gave it to the political process,
Mhm.
right? And we get baby split. That's why the church has to lead.
Yeah,
That's why the church has to lead, because the church is the arbiter of righteousness and justice, especially for who? The vulnerable,
yeah,
because the church is the place where the mercy seat is, right?
yeah.
So so
Wow.
that framework to me, is why again being pro abundant life is so important because it's anchored, it's the same yesterday, today, and forever, right?
Mhm.
It's tied to the life of Jesus, the words of Jesus, the gospel narrative, the biblical narrative is what frames that pro-abundant life perspective, whereas pro-life now is a political perspective that changes based on the platform. And you know that, right? The Republican
Yeah,
platform
yeah,
today
yeah,
ain't even the Republican platform that existed
yeah,
a year ago.
yeah,
Totally different. Totally different. But
yeah,
consider, by the way, the pro-life plank of the platform. But the
yeah,
pro-life plank of the Republican platform only bans late-term abortion, only wants to get rid of late-term abortions, which are after
yeah.
20 weeks, which is not the vast
1%.
majority of abortion. Do you see?
Wow, that's beautiful. Absolutely love that. The Pro Abundant Life framework. Um, where can we get the book? Tell us that, and then I want to ask you just kind of a one final practical step so we can wrap it up. This has been rich. I want to go back and listen to this again
Yeah.
myself a few times, but grab the book and we can do that
Yeah.
anywhere. Amazon. Where's
Yeah.
this
Well, it's
book?
basically Amazon. You go to Amazon and just put in the alternative to abortion, right? And
Yeah.
you'll find it there. So you can buy it through Amazon. People can obviously, they can also go to my website. I don't sell the book there, but they can see some more videos and some more things about, I'm talking about. It's rolandcwarren.com.
Okay.
And
Perfect.
visiting CareNet is care-net.org.
Okay. Perfect.
And then within the book, we talk about different ministry kits to get the church engaged, like Making Life Disciples, which is designed to help the church have small groups in the church that come alongside women inside and outside the church who are facing pregnancy decisions. That's the answer. So you walk alongside a woman facing a pregnancy decision or a couple facing a pregnancy decision. So to what end? So that they save their baby? Yes, but so also they become disciples of Jesus Christ.
I love
They're coming
that.
to
You
him.
just
So
added the whole second part to the, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
God, it's wonderful. Thank you for all the work you and all are doing. Okay. Last thing, give us some just super practical. If you're a couple listening to this and for some reason, um, you know, you ran across this and you're experiencing an unplanned pregnancy. What's a good next step for somebody, dad or mom?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think from a practical perspective, certainly you can contact our pregnancy decision line, which you can just put in
Okay.
pregnancy decision line in the web piece, and we'll talk you through some things. But it's great to get connected to a pregnancy center if
Okay.
you're struggling with an unplanned pregnancy. Again, you can come to CareNet's website and you can find a place to do that. But I think the biggest thing, honestly, is that the church, the church has to be engaged on this issue,
Mhm.
particularly if you're a Christian. I mean, the reality is pregnancy um, centers, their primary focus is for someone who doesn't know Christ,
Yeah.
right? So that they can, you know, offer them
Yeah.
compassion, hope, and help. But for someone who
Yeah.
is a Christian, we need to create an environment in our churches so that Planned Parenthood and the others are not a compassionate alternative to the church.
Mhm. Yeah.
So if you come to our website, you can learn. There are lots of resources there. If you go to our resource center for guys to help them step into the role as
Perfect.
fathers, like Dr. Dad and things of that nature, to get himself prepared to be able to care for his child as an infant and a toddler. It's one of the resources there. We've got Before You Decide, which is for moms who are facing pregnancy decisions to help them with that process. But I really think that as we start to anchor this issue back in the church So we walk alongside a couple facing a pregnancy decision so that if they bring their child into the world, adoption is also a life-affirming option. So there's so many people that want to adopt children, but there's alternatives to abortion that exist, and that's another one there too. And walk alongside that couple as they make the adoption decision. Certainly, people in the church and others who are looking for babies. There's more people that are looking for babies than babies available.
I love that. Yeah.
You have an alternative, but my biggest thing is that, again, kind of where I started. If you're a couple facing a pregnancy decision, particularly if you're a Christian couple, look at this issue through the lens of the Great Commandment. And believe me, I know as someone who maybe didn't have this framework when I made this decision, but I look at what God did with that decision, because ultimately that what we did is we walked in the Great Commandment in terms of this. I think once you start to think about it and pray about it, then God starts to open doors, starts to open resources, and starts to open connections to folks and saying, listen, I'm facing an obstacle and I want to bring this child into the world. I want to make a life-affirming decision here. And certainly if you're connected to, a church family and you disclaim that, again, the sex outside of marriage is the sin.
Yeah.
The baby's the blessing. That's the sin. And just like Jesus did with the woman who he caught in adultery, he said, what? Neither do I condemn you, but go and sin no more. In other words, sister, come as you are, but don't stay as you can. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So that's it.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you so much for the time. Thank you for the work. Thank you for what you're doing. And man, we just look forward to watching the movement grow and the pro-abundant life movement go forward. So thank you so much, Roland. Really appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this latest edition to the StoryField podcast. We hope that you have been challenged, inspired, and ready to take that next step, whatever that is. If you know someone with an amazing story that needs to be heard, send us an email at info@thestoryfield.com. Have a fantastic day, and we can't wait for you to join us on the next episode of The StoryField.